200 Comanche braves don't simply materialize at your homestead by mere chance or coincidence. They arrive seeking bloody vengeance, demanding righteous satisfaction, or preparing for devastating warfare. Thaddeus Bear Mallister was moments away from discovering their true and deadly purpose. However, this tale must begin where everything initially commenced and started. 24 hours previously, the absolutely merciless Texas sun was blazing down without any mercy whatsoever upon Bear's sprawling cattle ranch situated somewhere between the bustling town of Amarillo and the vast, endless emptiness of nowhere, when he initially observed and spotted the small, struggling silhouette stumbling desperately across his extensive territory and property. At 34 years of age, Bear had witnessed and experienced considerable hardship, trouble, and adversity during his many years spent managing and working cattle and livestock. Yet something significant regarding this particular morning carried a distinctly different quality and atmosphere, an ominous, foreboding sensation, even. He was working diligently to repair and fix a badly damaged fence post positioned near the flowing water source, when sudden movement seized and captured his immediate attention. A youngster, appearing to be no older than 8 or 9 years of age, was advancing and moving forward in unsteady, wavering, zigzagging patterns directly toward his creek and water supply. The child's garments and clothing were severely ripped and torn, traditional Native American attire and dress that had clearly and obviously experienced much better days and times. Even from his distant position and vantage point, Bear could easily observe and notice how severe starvation and hunger made each individual footstep a tremendous and overwhelming struggle for survival. The vast majority of cattle ranchers and livestock owners throughout these harsh and unforgiving regions would have immediately and without hesitation reached for their loaded firearms first and demanded detailed explanations and answers afterward. The complex relationship existing between white settlers and colonists and the local Comanche tribal communities and bands had remained extremely tense, strained, and volatile for numerous years and decades, with violent raids and brutal counter-raids keeping absolutely everyone constantly on high alert and perpetually vigilant. However, Bear had consistently and always been different from his neighboring ranchers and settlers, perhaps far too different for his own personal safety, security, and well-being. He carefully and deliberately set down his working tools and equipment and began walking slowly and cautiously in the direction of the mysterious child, ensuring his hands remained completely visible and his movements were deliberate, measured, and non-threatening in every possible way. As he drew closer and nearer to the small figure, he could clearly and distinctly see it was a young girl, her dark, expressive eyes appearing unnaturally large and prominent for her severely thin and gaunt face, her lips cracked, split, and damaged from severe dehydration and lack of water. She gazed upward at him with a complex expression combining raw fear and desperate desperation that struck him with the tremendous force of a physical punch delivered directly to his stomach and gut. The girl spoke rapidly and urgently in the Comanche language and dialect, using words and phrases he couldn't possibly understand or comprehend. But her meaning and intent were abundantly clear and unmistakable nonetheless. She was slowly starving to death, quite possibly and very likely hadn't consumed any food or sustenance whatsoever for several long days. Her small, delicate, trembling hands gestured repeatedly and frantically toward her mouth and lips, then pointed directly toward the flowing creek and water source, employing a universal language of desperate need and survival that successfully transcended any existing cultural barriers and differences between them. Bear found himself thinking deeply about his neighboring ranchers and settlers, contemplating and considering what their immediate reaction and response would be if they discovered and learned about him providing assistance and aid to a Comanche child. He carefully considered the numerous warnings and cautions he'd received while visiting town regarding recent escalating tensions and conflicts with the various tribal communities and groups. He thought carefully and thoroughly about the intelligent, smart thing to do, the safe, cautious, and prudent course of action that would protect and safeguard him from potential danger and harm. Then he looked directly and intensely into those desperately pleading and begging eyes once again and reached the fateful, life-changing decision that would completely and utterly change everything in his life forever and for all time. Without uttering a single word or sound, Bear carefully and gently scooped the girl up into his strong, capable arms. She weighed practically nothing at all, feeling almost weightless, and he carried her steadily and securely toward his modest, humble cabin and dwelling. She didn't attempt to resist his help or assistance, far too weak and exhausted to fight back or struggle even if she had possessed the desire or strength to do so. As he walked carefully across his property and land, he could distinctly feel her tiny, fragile body trembling and shaking continuously and persistently. Whether the shaking and trembling resulted from terror and fear, or hunger and starvation, or perhaps both combined together, he couldn't accurately determine or figure out. Inside his humble, modest, and simple cabin, Bear gently and carefully placed her down on his only available chair and moved quickly and efficiently to prepare nourishing, sustaining food. He possessed some remaining stew and broth left over from the previous evening, still maintaining adequate warmth on his reliable wood-burning stove, along with fresh, warm bread he had personally baked and prepared during that same morning. The rich, appetizing, and enticing smell and aroma of the prepared food seemed to somewhat revive and restore the girl, and for the very first time since their encounter, he witnessed something that might possibly have been hope and optimism flickering briefly and momentarily within her dark, expressive eyes. As he carefully and methodically ladled the warm, nourishing stew into a clean, available bowl, Bear suddenly caught sight of something specific that made his blood run completely cold throughout his entire body and being. Around the girl's slender, delicate neck, partially concealed and hidden by her torn and severely damaged clothing and garments, was a highly distinctive and recognizable necklace featuring intricate, elaborate beadwork and specific patterns and designs he had definitely and certainly seen before on previous occasions. His elderly neighbor and friend, old Pete Morrison, had described and detailed those exact same patterns and designs to him just the previous week during a casual conversation and discussion. They represented and symbolized the ceremonial beads traditionally worn by the immediate family members and relatives of Chief White Bull, widely recognized and acknowledged as the most powerful, influential, and feared Comanche leader throughout the entire region and territory. Bear's hand froze completely motionless and still, halfway through the motion of handing her the bowl of warm, nourishing stew. If this particular girl was indeed who he now suspected and believed her to be, he wasn't simply providing assistance and aid to a hungry and desperate child in need. He was actually harboring, sheltering, and protecting the beloved, precious daughter of the man who could effortlessly and easily bring 200 fierce, skilled warriors down upon his head without even breaking a sweat or experiencing the slightest difficulty or challenge. However, it was far too late to alter, change, or modify his chosen course of action now. The girl was already reaching eagerly toward the food with her small, delicate, shaking hands, and Bear found himself completely unable to summon the heart, courage, or resolve necessary to turn her away from his door and property. He handed her the bowl of warm stew and watched intently and carefully as she consumed it with the desperate, frantic hunger and appetite characteristic and typical of someone who hadn't seen any food or sustenance whatsoever for multiple long days and nights. What Bear remained completely unaware and ignorant of was that approximately 20 miles away from his ranch property, a large Comanche search party and group had just successfully discovered and found the girl's clear, obvious trail leading directly and unmistakably toward his property and homestead, and Chief White Bull himself was personally riding and leading at the head of that particular party and group. His weathered, experienced face displayed and showed a mask of pure fury, rage, and profound grief and sorrow that promised absolutely nothing except serious trouble, danger, and potentially deadly consequences for whoever had dared to take, capture, or harm his precious, beloved daughter. The girl finished consuming her meal completely and entirely and looked up at Bear with something that might possibly have been genuine gratitude, appreciation, and thankfulness. However, as the afternoon shadows began steadily lengthening and stretching across his property and land, Bear couldn't manage to shake or dismiss the persistent, nagging feeling that he had just made either the absolute best decision of his entire life or the very last decision he would ever have the opportunity or chance to make. The exhausted girl fell into deep, peaceful sleep while sitting comfortably in Bear's chair within approximately 1 hour, with complete exhaustion finally overtaking and claiming her small, fragile body entirely. Bear covered her carefully and tenderly with his only available blanket, and covering and attempted earnestly to convince himself that he had done the morally right, correct, and proper thing. However, as evening steadily approached and darkness began to fall, that conviction and certainty began to crumble, deteriorate, and weaken significantly. The distinctive, unmistakable sound of multiple hoofbeats and horses on the dirt road leading to his property made his stomach drop and sink with overwhelming dread and apprehension. Bear peered cautiously and carefully through his small cabin window and observed his neighbor and friend, Cletus Hartwell, riding hard, fast, and urgently toward his cabin accompanied by 2 other men Bear easily recognized and knew from town, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison and the local preacher and minister, Reverend Thomas. Bear stepped outside his cabin before they could dismount from their horses, desperately hoping to keep their voices lowered and quiet and avoid waking and disturbing the peacefully sleeping girl inside. However, Cletus was already shouting and yelling loudly before his horse came to a complete stop. "Bear, you damn fool! What in the hell are you thinking about doing here?" Cletus's face was bright red and flushed with anger, fury, and something that distinctly looked and appeared like genuine fear and terror. Morrison here claims and says he observed smoke signals rising from the hills this afternoon. The Comanche are actively searching and looking for something or someone specific and particular. Deputy Sheriff Morrison nodded with a grim, serious expression and demeanor. "My father sent urgent word and communication from town. Chief White Bull's daughter went missing and disappeared 3 full days ago during a hunting party expedition and journey. Word circulating and spreading is that she wandered off and became lost during a severe, violent storm." He paused deliberately and intentionally, studying Bear's face very carefully and intently. "You wouldn't happen to possess any knowledge or information about a missing Comanche girl, would you?" Bear felt his throat become completely dry and parched. The intelligent, smart thing would be to lie convincingly and effectively, to send them away and attempt to figure this dangerous, precarious situation out on his own. However, these men had been his neighbors, friends, and acquaintances for many long years. Despite their various flaws, shortcomings, and imperfections, they were present out of genuine concern and worry for his welfare and safety. "She's inside my cabin," Bear said quietly and softly, half-starved and completely exhausted. "I couldn't simply leave her outside to die and perish." The silence and quiet that immediately followed was absolutely deafening and overwhelming. Reverend Thomas was the first person to speak and respond, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "Son, do you possess any idea whatsoever about what you've accomplished and done here? I helped and assisted a hungry child in desperate need. Bear replied firmly and resolutely. However, even as he spoke those words and statements, he could clearly hear how naive, foolish, and innocent they sounded. Cletus began pacing back and forth nervously and anxiously, running his hands repeatedly and continuously through his hair. They're going to think and believe you deliberately took and captured her. Hell, they probably already believe and suspect that. White Bull has been known to completely wipe out and destroy entire settlements and communities for significantly less than this offense and transgression. Deputy Sheriff Morrison was already backing and retreating toward his horse. I have to report and communicate this situation and incident, Bear. It's my official duty and responsibility, but I'll provide you with a head start and advantage. Get her back to her people before they discover and find you here. In the complete darkness and night? Bear asked desperately and frantically. She can barely walk or move at all. And how exactly am I supposed to approach and near a Comanche camp without getting shot completely full of arrows and killed? That's your problem and challenge to solve now, Morrison said, mounting his horse. I'm riding immediately to town to warn and alert everyone else. If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch alone. As the three men rode away into the growing darkness and night, Bear stood completely alone and isolated in the deepening shadows, listening to the girl's quiet, peaceful breathing from inside the cabin. He thought about saddling up his horse and trying to locate and find the Comanche camp, but he knew with absolute certainty it was suicide and death. He considered loading her into his wagon and trying to reach the nearest town, but that would only make the entire situation significantly worse and more dangerous. The harsh, brutal truth was there existed no good, favorable way out of this predicament and dilemma. Every available option and choice led to the same destination and outcome: a direct, inevitable confrontation with one of the most feared, respected war chiefs in all of Texas. As if his worried, anxious thoughts had somehow summoned and called him, a new, ominous sound drifted across the vast, endless plains. The distant, rhythmic beating of war drums steadily growing closer and louder with each passing minute. Bear's blood turned to ice and froze. They weren't waiting for morning light and dawn. The Comanche were coming tonight. Bear rushed back into the cabin quickly and urgently, his mind racing frantically and desperately. The war drums were becoming louder and more intense, and he could now make out individual beats and rhythms within the complex pattern. Slow, methodical, deliberate, and absolutely terrifying and frightening. This wasn't the chaotic noise and sound typically associated with a raiding party or group. This was something far more organized, systematic, and infinitely more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered or experienced before in his entire life. Gideon Nash possessed nothing of value. No kin, no shelter, not even adequate clothing to shield him from the brutal mountain winds. Yet when he discovered the wounded girl lying motionless in the snow, his decision would summon 30 battle-ready warriors to his refuge before another day passed. What seemed like an act of simple humanity was about to unleash consequences more perilous than he could have conceived. The bitter wind sliced through Gideon's threadbare shirt as he navigated the treacherous slope, his belly aching from 3 days without sustenance. At 16, he'd mastered survival on scraps and sheer willpower, but the approaching tempest threatened to overwhelm even his weathered endurance. A crimson stain against pristine white caught his attention. Blood still wet, following the scarlet trail. Gideon found her a native girl, perhaps his own age, unconscious with a severe wound gaping across her thigh. Her deerskin garment was shredded, and ice crystals had begun forming in her raven hair. She had minutes before the cold claimed her. Every survival instinct demanded he continue walking. Interfering in tribal affairs meant danger, the kind that left settlers dead or worse. But studying her ashen features, something beyond mere survival stirred within him. "Can't abandon you here," he whispered, dropping to her side. She awakened at his touch, obsidian eyes flashing with terror. Her fingers sought the bone blade at her waist, but weakness made her movements sluggish. "Steady," Gideon said, showing empty palms. "I mean to help." She spoke urgently in her native language, gesturing toward the eastern summits. Despite the language barrier, her meaning was clear. She needed to reach home urgently. When she attempted to rise, her legs immediately gave way, a cry of anguish escaping as her injured limb collapsed. Gideon caught her before she struck the ground, feeling how dangerously cold her skin had become. Hypothermia was advancing. "Those peaks," he asked, indicating eastward. "That's 2 days through Devil's Canyon." She nodded desperately, frozen tears streaking her cheeks. Gideon assessed his meager provisions, barely sufficient food for himself, no medical supplies, and winter gear more patched than fabric. Escorting her through the mountains would likely doom them both. Yet abandoning her here guaranteed her death. "Very well," he said softly. "Together or not at all?" For 18 grueling hours, Gideon half-carried, half-dragged the girl through terrain that would challenge seasoned mountaineers. She drifted between consciousness and delirium, murmuring words he couldn't comprehend but felt deeply. Perhaps prayers of desperation, perhaps warnings. When they finally reached her tribal territory's edge, she managed to stand independently. She pressed something into his hand, a small carved stone, before vanishing into the forest without backward glance. Gideon stumbled back to his mountain shelter as dawn emerged, exhausted but alive. He'd acted righteously, even if it nearly killed him. But approaching his cave, something froze his blood. Countless hoof prints encircled his dwelling. Fresh tracks, carved into the adjacent tree, was an unfamiliar symbol. 3 parallel lines bisected by an arrow. Someone had been here, someone who knew precisely where to locate him. Gideon circled his cave thrice before entering, his hand never leaving the rusty blade at his belt. The hoof prints revealed a story he preferred not to read. At least 15 horses, possibly more, all shod in the distinctive style of tribal ponies. They'd waited for hours, examining his sparse belongings, studying his routines. Inside, everything appeared exactly as he'd left it. Yet something felt wrong. His sleeping blanket had shifted slightly, enough for someone who knew every thread of his few possessions. His cooking pot sat at an altered angle. Even his collection of river stones had been disturbed. "They searched for something," he murmured to the empty cave. But what could he possibly possess that would interest warriors? He owned nothing valuable, no gold, no worthy weapons, no intelligence about settler movements. Unless his fingers found the carved stone the girl had given him. In daylight, he could examine it clearly. Polished obsidian with intricate symbols etched deep into its surface. It felt warm against his skin, almost living. A branch cracked outside. Gideon froze, every muscle tensing. That wasn't wind. Something heavy had stepped on deadwood, trying to move silently, but failing. Peering through a rock crevice, his heart nearly ceased. 3 warriors sat motionless on horseback 30 yards distant, observing his cave. War paint streaked their faces. Eagle feathers adorned their dark hair. Their gaze never wavered from his hiding place. They knew he was inside. How long had they waited? How had they tracked him so swiftly? The girl couldn't have informed them. She'd barely been conscious when they separated. One warrior raised his hand, and behind Gideon's cave, horses whinnied softly. More riders. He was surrounded. The lead warrior dismounted slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on a tomahawk that appeared recently bloodied. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air. "Boy, who helped our daughter, we know you are there." Gideon's throat constricted. Daughter. The girl was someone important, not merely any tribal member, but family to these men. "Come out. We wish to speak." Every fiber of Gideon's being screamed danger. In every tale he'd heard, white men who became involved in tribal matters ended scalped or worse. But he was trapped like prey in a den, with nowhere to flee and winter approaching. The warrior continued, his voice carrying an edge that chilled Gideon's skin. "You possess something belonging to us." The carved stone seemed to burn against his palm. Whatever this object was, it was significant enough to bring armed men into the mountains, important enough to track him within hours. Gideon closed his eyes, feeling his decision's weight. Emerge and face whatever these warriors wanted, or remain hidden and eventually perish from thirst and cold when winter trapped him in the cave. When he opened his eyes, the lead warrior was walking directly toward his cave entrance. His expression suggesting patience was no longer viable. Gideon stepped from the cave with raised hands, the carved stone concealed in his closed fist. 30 warriors materialized from behind rocks and trees like shadows gaining form. More men than he'd imagined, all armed, all watching with unreadable expressions. The lead warrior stopped 5 feet away, close enough that Gideon could see the intricate scars marking his weathered face. This was no ordinary hunting party. These were seasoned fighters, and their presence meant something far more serious than a simple rescue. "I am Takakota," the warrior said in measured English. "Ayana is my daughter." Gideon's mouth went dry. A chief's daughter? He'd rescued a chief's daughter unknowingly, and now her father stood before him with sufficient men to level a small settlement. "She described what you did," Takakota continued, his dark eyes never leaving Gideon's face. "How you carried her through killing cold when you could have abandoned her." The other warriors remained silent, but Gideon could feel their tension like electricity before storm. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and this conversation would end very differently. Anyone would have done the same, Gideon managed, though his voice cracked. Takakota's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "No, most would not. Most fear us too much to risk helping." He gestured to his men. "We have been hunting the men who attacked our camp. 3 settlers with rifles who shot my daughter when she tried to warn them from our sacred grounds." Gideon felt ice form in his stomach. Settlers, white men like him, men who might assume he was collaborating with them. "We tracked them to your mountain," Takakota said, his voice hardening. "Their trail led directly past your cave. We thought perhaps." He left the sentence hanging, but the implication struck Gideon like a physical blow. They'd suspected his involvement in the attack. "But Ayana described the boy who saved her," Takakota continued. "Thin, hungry, with kind eyes and gentle hands. Not the description of a man who shoots women." Relief flooded through Gideon, but it was temporary. If these warriors were hunting armed settlers in his territory, blood would be spilled soon. And when territorial authorities investigated, they'd find him, the only white face in the area. "The men you're hunting," Gideon said carefully, "they're still here?" Takakota nodded grimly. "Close, very close. They camped in the valley below, thinking themselves safe." His hand moved to his tomahawk. "They are mistaken. One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly in their native tongue, pointing toward the valley. Takakota's expression darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Gideon asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to know. "My scout reports smoke rising from their camp. They are cooking fresh meat." Takakota's voice turned deadly quiet. "Meat they stole from families they murdered yesterday." The situation's weight crashed down on Gideon. He was trapped between a war party seeking vengeance and desperate criminals with nothing left to lose. The mountains that had been his sanctuary were about to become a killing ground. Takakota stepped closer, his presence commanding and dangerous. "You saved my daughter's life. For this I offer you a choice." Gideon waited, hardly breathing. "Leave these mountains now before sunset. Ride far and fast and never return." Takakota's eyes bore into him. "Or stay and help us end the men who spill innocent blood on sacred ground." The carved stone felt heavy in Gideon's palm as he realized the impossible position he faced. Run and spend his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if he'd made the right choice, or stay and become part of something that could destroy everything he'd built. But as Takakota awaited his answer, gunshots echoed from the valley below. The gunshots reverberated off the mountain walls like thunder, followed by screams that chilled Gideon's blood. Not war cries, but screams of terror and pain. Takakota's warriors instantly transformed from waiting statues into fluid motion, mounting their horses with practiced efficiency. But Takakota himself remained motionless, his eyes locked on Gideon. "Choose now, boy. The killing has begun." Another volley of shots cracked through the air, closer this time. Someone was running up the mountain, firing wildly as they climbed through the trees. Gideon glimpsed 3 figures scrambling up the rocky slope, the settlers fleeing toward his cave with desperate panic. "They're coming here," Gideon breathed, realizing the horrible truth. The criminals knew about his cave. They were leading the fight directly to his doorstep. Takakota's expression turned deadly. "You know these men?" "No," Gideon said quickly. "But they've been watching my camp. They know where I live." The lead warrior's hand tightened on his weapon. In seconds, armed murderers would reach the cave, followed by 30 tribal warriors seeking blood. Gideon would be caught in the middle of a massacre with nowhere to run. "Get behind the rocks," Takakota commanded his men. "Let them come." But Gideon saw something that made his stomach drop. One of the fleeing settlers carried a rifle he recognized, a distinctive brass-fitted weapon he'd seen in town. It belonged to Marshal Crawford, the territorial lawman missing for 2 weeks. These weren't just thieves or claim jumpers. They'd killed a federal marshal. "Wait," Gideon called out as the first settler crashed through the trees 50 yards below. "If you kill him here, the army will come. They'll blame your people for the marshal's death." Takakota paused, understanding the implications immediately. Dead settlers at a native ambush site would bring cavalry troops and retribution against his entire tribe. The 3 criminals were close enough now that Gideon could see their faces, desperate, wild-eyed men with blood on their clothes and death in their wake. The leader spotted the cave and pointed, shouting something to his companions. They were going to use his shelter as a fort. "You cannot let them reach the cave," Takakota said grimly. "If they take position there, we must dig them out. Many will die." Gideon's mind raced. The settlers were 30 seconds from his cave. The warriors needed a clear shot, but couldn't risk being blamed for a massacre. He was the only one who could prevent it from becoming a bloodbath that would destroy innocent lives. The carved stone seemed to pulse in his palm. Suddenly, he understood why Anna had given it to him. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a symbol of trust, of responsibility. He stepped into the open, directly into the path of the climbing criminals. "That's far enough," he shouted, raising his hands. The lead settler raised his rifle, finger on the trigger, his eyes wild with desperation and fear. "Get out of the way, boy, or I'll put you down." Behind the rocks, 30 warriors drew their weapons silently, waiting for Takakota's signal. One wrong word from Gideon, and the mountain would explode in violence. But instead of stepping aside, Gideon did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He sat down right there in the middle of the confrontation, with rifles pointed at his chest and 30 warriors ready to strike. He calmly lowered himself to the ground and crossed his legs like he had all the time in the world. "What the hell are you doing?" the lead criminal snarled, his rifle wavering between Gideon and the rocks where he could sense hidden danger. "Waiting for you to make a choice," Gideon said quietly. "See, you can shoot me, but the moment you pull that trigger, you'll have bigger problems than whatever's chasing you up that mountain." The criminal's eyes darted around nervously. His 2 companions reached the rocky outcrop, gasping and bleeding from cuts sustained during their panic climb. They'd lost their horses, most of their ammunition, and clearly hadn't eaten in days. "We just need to use your cave for a few hours," the leader said, trying to sound reasonable. "Then we'll be gone." "That cave belongs to the tribe whose land you're standing on," Gideon replied, pulling out the carved stone. "And they don't take kindly to trespassers." The moment the criminals saw the tribal artifact, their faces went white. They'd spent enough time in the territory to know what it meant. "You're working with them?" the second man gasped. "I'm trying to keep you alive," Gideon said, "which is more than you deserve after what you did to Marshal Crawford." The leader's rifle snapped back to Gideon. "How do you know about that?" "Because you're carrying his weapon, and his blood is still on your clothes." Gideon's voice stayed steady despite his racing heart. "Question is, how many other innocent people did you kill on your way up here?" Behind the rocks, Takakota's warriors remained hidden but ready. Gideon could feel their presence like coiled springs, waiting for the signal to strike. But he also knew that once the violence started, it wouldn't stop until everyone was dead. "Here's what's going to happen," Gideon continued. "You're going to put down your weapons and surrender to tribal justice. Or you're going to keep running and hope you make it to the territorial border before winter kills you." "Like hell," the leader spat. "We're taking that cave." But as he stepped forward, an arrow buried itself in the ground 6 inches from his boot. Then another, then a third, each one closer than the last. The criminals spun around wildly, trying to spot the archers, but saw only empty rocks and shifting shadows. Panic began to overtake desperation in their eyes. 30 warriors, Gideon said conversationally, all around you, all with orders to take you alive if possible. He paused. "But they're not feeling particularly merciful after what you did to their families." The truth hit the criminals like a physical blow. They weren't being chased by a small hunting party. They'd stumbled into the territory of an entire war band seeking vengeance. "You led us into a trap," the leader accused, his voice cracking. "You led yourselves," Gideon replied, "the moment you chose to spill innocent blood on sacred ground." Another arrow whispered past the second criminal's ear, and his nerve broke completely. He dropped his rifle and raised his hands, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "I surrender. I surrender." But the leader wasn't finished. With nothing left to lose and madness gleaming in his eyes, he swung his rifle toward Gideon. "If I'm dying today, you're coming with me." The shot echoed across the mountains, but Gideon never felt the bullet. A tomahawk had already found its mark, and the criminal leader crumpled to the ground before his finger could fully squeeze the trigger. Takakota emerged from behind the rocks, his remaining warriors flowing around the two surviving criminals like water around stones. In seconds, the threat was over. But as Gideon stood up, brushing dirt from his clothes, he realized something that chilled him more than the mountain wind. The gunshot would bring cavalry troops within days, and when they arrived, they'd find dead settlers in tribal territory with Gideon as the only witness to what really happened. Takakota bound the two surviving criminals with rawhide strips while his warriors searched the bodies. What they found confirmed Gideon's worst fears: military dispatches, territorial maps, and a cavalry officer's insignia hidden in the dead leader's pack. "These men killed more than settlers," Takakota said grimly, holding up the officer's bars. "They attacked a military patrol." Gideon's stomach dropped. Killing a marshal was serious enough, but attacking cavalry troops meant the army would send a full company to investigate. They'd follow the trail of destruction directly to this mountain, and when they found bodies in tribal territory, they wouldn't ask questions. "How long before soldiers come?" Takakota asked. 3 days, maybe 4, Gideon replied, trying to calculate distances and army response times. "But when they get here, they'll see dead whites and live natives. It won't matter what really happened." The chief's weathered face showed no emotion, but Gideon could see the weight of responsibility in his dark eyes. One wrong decision could bring war to his people, women and children who had nothing to do with this violence. "My warriors want to scalp these men and leave their bodies for the soldiers to find," Takakota said quietly. "Show them what happens to those who attack our families. That'll start a war that'll kill more innocents than these 3 ever could," Gideon said urgently. One of the bound criminals, a young man barely older than Gideon, began sobbing uncontrollably. "Please don't scalp me. Please, I never killed nobody. I just ran when the shooting started." Takakota studied the crying man with cold calculation. "You ran with murderers. You took their blood money. You are guilty." But something in the young criminal's terror sparked an idea in Gideon's mind. A desperate plan that might save everyone if he could convince Takakota to trust him completely. What if the soldiers never found bodies at all? Gideon said slowly. Takakota's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "These men were running from something bigger than your war party. They mentioned gold, claim jumps, territorial disputes. What if they just disappeared, got lost in the mountains during winter, never to be seen again?" The surviving criminals' eyes widened in horror as they realized what Gideon was suggesting. "The army would still come looking," Takakota pointed out. "But they find my testimony instead of bodies," Gideon said. "I tell them the truth. Criminals came through, got caught in an early blizzard, probably died somewhere in the deep ravines. Happens every winter." Takakota was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that could determine his people's survival. His warriors watched him intently, ready to follow whatever decision he made. "And these two?" he asked, nodding toward the bound men. "They come with us. Your people need witnesses who can confirm that the tribe acted in self-defense, not aggression. When the time comes, they'll tell the truth about who started the killing." The young criminal nodded frantically. "Yes, I'll tell them everything. How Crawford tried to arrest us for claim jumping. How my partner shot him when he wouldn't take our bribe. I'll swear to it." But Takakota's expression remained skeptical. White man's word means nothing when spoken against white soldiers. "Maybe," Gideon admitted, "but it's better than starting a war over dead criminals." A warrior approached Takakota and spoke rapidly in their native tongue, pointing toward the valley. The chief's face darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "Scout reports army dust on the eastern trail. They are already coming. Gideon felt ice form in his veins. How many? 20 soldiers moving fast. They had hours, not days. Whatever plan they chose had to happen now, before the cavalry arrived and found evidence of the confrontation. Takakota looked from the bodies to his warriors to Gideon, the weight of his people's future pressing down on him like the approaching winter storm. Takakota made his decision with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his life balancing war and survival. We move the bodies to the deep canyon, he commanded his warriors. Make it look like they fell during storm. As the warriors lifted the dead criminal, Gideon noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man's rifle had discharged when he fell, and the bullet had struck the rocky wall of Gideon's cave, leaving a fresh scar in the stone. The cavalry will see that, Gideon said, pointing to the bullet mark. They'll know there was a fight here. Takakota examined the damaged stone, his jaw tightening. Then we make them see something else. The chief barked orders in his native tongue, and his warriors immediately began transforming the scene. They scattered cooking gear around the cave entrance, built a small fire pit, and even spread Gideon's few belongings to make it look like a long-term camp. What are you doing? Gideon asked. Creating a story the soldiers will believe, Takakota replied, pulling out a piece of charcoal. You have been living here peacefully. The criminals came, demanded supplies, and fired warning shots when you refused. With swift strokes, Takakota darkened the bullet scar until it looked like old fire damage rather than fresh lead. Other warriors scattered brass cartridge cases from an old hunting trip, making it appear that multiple people had been shooting over several days. You fought them off, Takakota continued, but they fled into the storm. You never saw them again. It was a good story, but Gideon spotted a fatal flaw. What about their horses? The cavalry will track them here. Takakota smiled grimly. Their horses died in the canyon with them. Tragic accident. The efficiency was breathtaking. In less than an hour, 30 warriors had completely altered the crime scene, moved 3 bodies to a remote ravine, and created a convincing narrative that would satisfy military investigators. But as they finished, one of the bound criminals began panicking. You can't just leave us with him, the older man pleaded, staring at Gideon with desperate eyes. What happens when the soldiers leave? What happens to us then? Takakota's expression was unreadable. That depends on whether you keep your word about telling the truth. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. The cavalry was closer than expected, their pace indicating urgency rather than routine patrol. Take positions, Takakota ordered his warriors, but stay hidden until I signal. As his men melted into the landscape, Takakota placed a firm hand on Gideon's shoulder. The gesture was more than tactical. It was acceptance, trust, recognition. You saved my daughter's life, the chief said quietly. Today, you may save my people's future. This makes you brother to our tribe, if you choose to accept it. Before Gideon could respond, the carved stone in his palm grew warm. He looked down and saw that its symbols had changed in the light, revealing deeper meanings he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just a token of gratitude. It was a mark of adoption, of belonging. I accept, Gideon whispered. Takakota nodded once, then vanished into the rocks as if he'd never been there. 20 cavalry soldiers crested the ridge, their blue uniforms stark against the winter landscape. At their head rode a captain with the weathered look of a career frontier officer, his eyes already scanning for signs of the violence that had brought them here. Gideon stood alone beside his cave, 2 bound criminals at his feet, preparing to tell a story that would either save an entire tribe or condemn them all. The captain reined in his horse 10 feet away, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Son, I'm Captain Morrison, Territorial Cavalry. We're tracking 3 men who killed a federal marshal and attacked a military convoy. Have you seen them?" Gideon met Captain Morrison's gaze steadily, the carved stone warm in his palm. "I saw them, Captain. 3 men, desperate and dangerous. They came through here 2 days ago, demanding supplies and shelter." The captain dismounted, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the camp. "And I refused to help criminals," Gideon said simply. "Told them to move on." That's when the shooting started. He pointed to the darkened scar on the cave wall. "Warning shots, trying to scare me into cooperation. When that didn't work, they took what little food I had and headed into the high country." Captain Morrison examined the bullet mark, the scattered brass casings, the signs of struggle. Everything supported Gideon's story. "These the men who were with them?" the captain asked, nodding toward the bound criminals. "No, sir. These 2 showed up yesterday, half frozen and starving. So they've been traveling with the gang, but got separated during a snowstorm in the deep canyon." The older prisoner nodded frantically. "That's right. Crawford tried to arrest us for claim jumping, but when he wouldn't take our partner's bribe, they shot him. Me and Billy here, we just ran when the killing started." The younger criminal, Billy, was crying again. "We never wanted anybody to die, Captain. When the shooting started in that canyon, we just kept running. Haven't seen our partners since." Captain Morrison studied their faces carefully. Frontier soldiers learned to read desperation and truth in equal measure. "You're saying your partners are still out there?" "If they're still alive," Billy whispered, "that canyon's a death trap in winter. Nobody could survive up there without proper gear." The captain walked to the edge of the rocky outcrop and stared into the vast wilderness beyond, miles of treacherous terrain, hidden ravines, and early winter storms that could bury men without a trace. "We'll search the area," Morrison decided. "But if they went into the deep country during that storm?" He shrugged. "Nature's got its own justice out here." Gideon felt relief flood through him, but kept his expression neutral. "What about these 2? They'll stand trial for their part in Crawford's death, but their cooperation will be noted." The captain mounted his horse. "Son, you did the right thing, refusing to help those killers. It took courage." As the cavalry prepared to leave with their prisoners, Captain Morrison paused. "You planning to winter up here alone?" Gideon looked toward the hidden rocks, where he knew Takakota's warriors waited. "Actually, Captain, I've been offered a place with some local friends. Good people who know these mountains better than anyone." "Smart choice. These peaks aren't forgiving to men without allies." After the soldiers disappeared down the mountain trail, Takakota emerged from concealment, his warriors flowing out of the landscape like morning mist. The chief's weathered face showed something Gideon had never seen before: genuine gratitude mixed with deep respect. "You spoke well, brother," Takakota said, using the tribal word that meant family by choice rather than blood. "Your words have prevented much bloodshed." Gideon held out the carved stone, but Takakota shook his head. "Keep it. You have earned the right." The chief placed a firm hand on Gideon's shoulder. "Our winter camp has room for 1 more if you choose to stay." Looking back at his empty cave, then at the warriors who had accepted him as family, Gideon's decision came easily. "I choose to stay." That evening, as snow began falling on the high peaks, Gideon sat beside a warm fire in the tribal camp, learning his first words in their language while Ayana translated stories of courage and belonging. The homeless boy who had possessed nothing was now a brother to an entire people. His act of simple kindness had transformed not just his own destiny, but prevented a war that could have destroyed countless innocent lives. The carved stone rested in his palm, no longer a mysterious artifact, but a symbol of the family he had gained by choosing compassion over safety, courage over comfort. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo through history in ways we never expect, changing not just our own path, but the fate of entire communities. In choosing to help one wounded girl in the snow, Gideon had found something more valuable than gold or safety. He had found his place in the world and a family willing to call him brother. She was merely a tiny orphan child dwelling alone beside the stream. But her actions toward a wounded stranger that evening would draw 30 armed braves to her threshold at daybreak and transform both their destinies forever. The youngster's screams rang out over the rushing waters as twilight settled across the untamed land. Clementine Shaw, scarcely 8 years old, released the kindling she'd been collecting and hurried toward the commotion. Through the evening fog, she glimpsed her, a girl near her own age, flailing in the shallow currents, one limb obviously damaged as she battled against the flow. Most frontier youngsters would have fled back to their households. But Clementine possessed no household to retreat to. The modest dwelling behind her contained only the ghost of her grandmother, who had died 3 months prior, abandoning her utterly isolated in this remote section of river territory. Perhaps that explained her lack of hesitation. Perhaps that's how solitude bred courage. The native child's black tresses clung to her skull as she panted and stretched frantically for the distant shore. Her limb, bent at an abnormal angle, couldn't bear her weight against the stones. Each attempt to rise sent the current toppling her again. Terror and agony filled her gaze as she noticed Clementine on the opposite bank. For an instant, they merely gazed at each other across the gap. Two youngsters, separate realms, one drowning while the other observed. Clementine had listened to tales murmured in settlement about native attacks, about children seized in darkness, about perils that prowled beyond the community boundaries. Her grandmother had cautioned her to avoid their people, but all she witnessed was an injured child requiring assistance. Without further consideration, Clementine stepped into the frigid water. The current instantly clutched at her tattered gown, threatening to carry her downstream, but she pushed onward. The riverbed was treacherous with moss-slick stones, and twice she nearly stumbled as she navigated across the perilous channel. Upon reaching the struggling girl, Clementine could observe the severity of her wounds closely. The girl's limb was severely swollen, likely fractured, and fresh gashes marked her arms where she'd been pulling herself through the undergrowth. Her respiration came in sharp, agonized pants, and her flesh felt cold and damp to touch. The girl spoke in her native language, urgent, frightened utterances that Clementine couldn't comprehend. But she didn't require understanding the dialect to recognize appreciation when she witnessed it. Cooperating, they succeeded in bringing the injured child to the safer, shallower water near Clementine's side of the stream. Ascending the muddy embankment proved even more challenging. The girl, who managed to whisper Ayana, when Clementine indicated herself and stated her own name, couldn't place any pressure on her damaged limb. Clementine, small as she was, had to partially support, partially haul her new companion up the steep incline to cabin. By the time they reached the crude wooden entrance, both girls were drained and drenched completely. Clementine's grandmother had left basic healing supplies, and she attempted her best to cleanse Ayana's wounds and construct a brace from wooden sticks and torn cloth. The native girl endured the procedure with extraordinary fortitude, only flinching when Clementine had to realign what was clearly a broken bone. As the night deepened around the small cabin, Clementine shared her modest dinner of cornbread and wild berries. They sat beside the dancing firelight, two orphans from different realms, communicating through motions and the universal dialect of compassion. Ayana's fever had subsided, and some vitality was returning to her face. But what Clementine didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly realize, as she settled her unexpected visitor onto the cabin's sole bed, was that Ayana hadn't simply become lost. She was the daughter of Chief Running Bear, leader of the most formidable tribe in the territory, and 30 of his finest braves had been seeking her since she'd vanished 2 days earlier. Following her path that led directly to this isolated cabin by the stream, as Clementine drifted toward sleep on the hard wooden floor, wrapped in her grandmother's blanket, she had no notion that the sound of approaching hoofbeats was already growing nearer in the distance. The first rays of sunrise filtered through the cabin's single window. But it wasn't the dawn that roused Clementine. It was the sound of horses. Many horses encircling her home like thunder rolling across the ground. She sat upright quickly, her heart pounding against her ribs as reality crashed over her. Through the cracks in the wooden walls she could see them, painted warriors on horseback, their faces stern and merciless in the pale morning light. Feathers swayed in their hair, and weapons gleamed at their sides. They had formed a perfect circle around the tiny cabin, blocking every possible escape route, 30 of them, just as the stories had warned. Ayana stirred on the bed, her fever-bright eyes focusing on the sounds outside, when she heard the familiar rhythm of her people's horses. Her face transformed with relief and joy. She tried to sit up, calling out in her native tongue, words that sounded like celebration to Clementine's ears, though she couldn't understand their meaning. But the warriors outside didn't respond with the same joy. Their voices rose in harsh commands, and Clementine heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being prepared. Through the window, she could see the lead warrior, a man whose presence commanded respect even from this distance, dismounting from his horse with deadly purpose. Terror flooded through Clementine's small body. Everything she'd ever heard about what happened to children who crossed paths with war parties came rushing back to her. The stories of burned homesteads, of families that simply vanished, of children taken and never seen again. She had saved Ayana's life, but now it seemed she had sealed her own fate in the process. Ayana must have seen the fear in Clementine's face because she reached out with surprising strength. Grasping the younger girl's hand, she spoke urgently, pointing to herself and then to the door, her meaning clear, even without shared language. She would explain. She would tell them what Clementine had done. But would they listen? Or had Clementine's act of kindness already been interpreted as something far more sinister? The footsteps outside grew closer, deliberate and measured. Multiple sets of boots approached the door, and Clementine could hear the low murmur of voices discussing something in their native language. The tone was serious, almost grim, and she caught what sounded like anger in their words. Ayana struggled to her feet despite her injured leg, leaning heavily against the wall as she prepared to face her people. She looked back at Clementine with eyes that seemed much older than her 9 years. And in that moment, both girls understood that everything would change when that door opened. The knock came like a thunderclap, 3 sharp raps that seemed to shake the entire cabin. But it wasn't the violent, battering Clementine had expected. It was controlled, almost respectful, as if they were requesting permission rather than demanding entry. Still, Clementine's hand trembled as she reached for the wooden latch, knowing that her next decision would determine whether she lived to see another sunset in this wilderness she'd called home. The door swung open to reveal the most imposing man Clementine had ever seen. Chief Running Bear stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the morning light behind him. War paint streaked his weathered face in patterns that spoke of both ceremony and battle, and his dark eyes held the kind of authority that comes from leading warriors through life and death. But those fierce eyes immediately softened when they fell upon Ayana. The chief spoke a single word, what sounded like a name spoken with infinite relief, and Ayana responded with a flood of words in their native tongue. Her voice was urgent but respectful as she gestured toward Clementine, pointing to her bandaged leg, to the makeshift splint, to the empty bowl that had held their shared meal. Clementine stood frozen in the doorway, barely reaching the chief's chest as more warriors gathered behind him. Their faces remained unreadable, but she could feel their eyes taking in every detail. The medicine supplies scattered on the table, the blood-stained cloth from Ayana's wounds, the careful way the native girl favored her injured leg. As Ayana continued speaking, something remarkable began to happen. The tension that had filled the air like smoke started to dissipate. The chief's expression changed from stern authority to something that looked almost like wonder. His gaze shifted between his daughter and the small white child who had clearly spent the night caring for her. Other warriors leaned forward to hear Ayana's account, and Clementine caught her own name repeated several times. Each time Ayana said Clementine, she would gesture with obvious gratitude, touching her heart and then extending her hand toward her rescuer. But the moment that changed everything came when Ayana struggled to demonstrate what had happened at the river. Despite her pain, she mimicked falling into the water, showed how Clementine had waded in to help her, and acted out the careful journey to the cabin. When she reached the part about the medical care, she lifted her splinted leg and spoke with such emotion that tears gathered in her eyes. Chief Running Bear listened to every word, his weathered face growing more thoughtful with each detail. When his daughter finished her account, he turned his full attention to Clementine. For a long moment, he simply studied her, this tiny orphan girl who had risked her own safety for a stranger. Then he did something that shocked everyone present, including his own warriors. The great chief knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to Clementine's eye level. In halting but clear English, he spoke his first words to her. "You saved my heart." He placed his hand over his chest, then gestured toward Ayana. "My daughter, my heart you save." The warriors behind him exchanged glances of amazement. Their chief, a man who had never bowed to white settlers and had fought to protect their lands from encroachment, was kneeling before a child. But what he said next would change not just Clementine's life, but the relationship between two worlds that had been at war for generations. Chief Running Bear reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew something that made his warriors gasp audibly. It was a medallion unlike anything Clementine had ever seen, carved from what looked like sacred stone and strung on a cord of braided horsehair. The intricate symbols etched into its surface seemed to tell an ancient story of protection and honor. "This," the chief said slowly, holding the medallion between them, "belonged to my father. His father before many generations." His English was careful but determined, each word chosen with the weight of ceremony. "Only give to family, to blood." Ayana's eyes widened in shock. She spoke rapidly to her father in their language, her voice filled with what sounded like protest or disbelief. But the chief raised his hand for silence, his decision clearly made. "You have no family," he continued, looking directly into Clementine's eyes. "We have no daughter like you, but heart knows truth. Spirit knows kindness." He paused, searching for the right words. "You are sister to Ayana now, daughter to Running Bear." The medallion felt warm in Clementine's small hands as he placed it around her neck. The moment it settled against her chest, she felt something shift in the air around them. The warriors, who had seemed so threatening just moments before, now looked at her with expressions of respect and acceptance. But the chief wasn't finished with his surprises. "Alone is dangerous," he said, gesturing toward the isolated cabin. "Winter approaches quickly. No kin to assist, no safety." He rose to his full stature again, his resolution clearly formed. "You accompany us. Discover our customs." "Ayana learns your customs." Both daughters now. Clementine's thoughts spun. Everything she had ever experienced, this dwelling, Her grandmother's legacy, the familiar curve in the stream, was being exchanged for something entirely unfamiliar. The anxiety of leaving her past battled with the dread of enduring another winter isolated, surviving on whatever scraps she could collect or catch. Ayanna struggled upright and grasped Clementine's hand, speaking gently in a blend of English phrases and her native language. "Come, sister," she managed to express. Protected, warm kinship. The term kinship struck Clementine like a physical impact. She hadn't truly belonged to anyone since her grandmother's passing. The isolation that had been her constant companion for months suddenly felt overwhelming in the face of this unexpected offer of connection. But even as hope flourished in her chest, uncertainty crept in. What would the other tribal members think of a white child among them? Would she be welcomed? Or would she remain forever an outsider peering in? And what about the world she would be abandoning? Would she ever encounter another white face? Ever return to the existence she had known? Chief Running Bear seemed to detect her reluctance. "No decision now," he said kindly. "Time to consider." But he surveyed the empty cabin, noting its isolation and the signs of a child struggling to survive alone. "We not wait for choices." As if called by his words, a frigid breeze suddenly swept through the open entrance, carrying with it the scent of snow from the distant peaks. Clementine shivered, recalling how difficult the previous winter had been, even with her grandmother's assistance. The chief stepped back, allowing her space to process his proposal. But his next words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind. "Other perils approach soon. Soldiers seek Ayanna's path. Find tracks to cabin. Better not be here when they arrive." The chief's warning about soldiers sent ice through Clementine's veins. She had heard tales about the cavalry patrols that swept through the territory, treating any contact between settlers and natives as potential conspiracy. If they discovered evidence that she had sheltered Ayanna, they wouldn't inquire first. "How? How long?" Clementine managed to whisper. One of the warriors stepped forward and spoke urgently to his chief in their native tongue. Running Bear's expression darkened as he listened. Then he turned back to Clementine with new urgency in his voice. "Midday, today," he said, indicating toward the sky, maybe earlier. The reality crashed over her like the river current that had nearly claimed Ayanna. Remain here and face questioning or worse from soldiers who would view her kindness as betrayal, or abandon everything behind and venture into a world completely unknown to her. Ayanna squeezed her hand tighter, sensing her inner conflict. Despite her pain, the native girl managed to stand and limp toward the small collection of items that represented Clementine's entire existence. Her grandmother's blanket, a wooden doll carved by hands long deceased, a few precious volumes, and a tin container holding her grandmother's wedding band. With careful movements, Ayanna began gathering these treasures, speaking softly to her father. The chief nodded and gestured to two of his warriors, who immediately moved to help pack Clementine's belongings with surprising gentleness. "You bring grandmother's soul," the chief said, watching as they wrapped the blanket carefully. "Honor ancestors. We understand this." But even as relief flooded through her at his understanding, a new fear seized Clementine's heart. What if I can't learn your ways? What if I don't belong? For the first time since arriving, Chief Running Bear smiled, an expression that transformed his entire face from stern authority to warm father. "Ayanna could not walk river alone," he said simply. "You teach her strength. She teach you belonging. Both learn together." The sound of distant hoofbeats suddenly echoed across the valley, still far away, but approaching fast. The warriors immediately stiffened, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The chief's smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Soldiers," he said grimly, "time to choose is now." Clementine looked around the cabin one last time, at the rough wooden table where her grandmother had taught her to read, at the fireplace where they had shared countless quiet evenings, at the window that framed the river where her new life had begun just hours ago. Then she looked at Ayanna, who was watching her with eyes full of hope and friendship, and Chief Running Bear, who had offered her something she thought she'd lost forever: family. The warriors had already accepted her as one of their own. The hoofbeats were getting closer. Clementine reached up and touched the sacred medallion resting against her chest, feeling its weight and warmth. Then she made the decision that would reshape two worlds. "I'm ready." The moment Clementine spoke those words, the warriors moved with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, her few possessions were secured on horseback, and a gentle mare was brought forward, calm and steady, chosen specifically for a child who had never ridden. Chief Running Bear lifted Clementine onto the horse's back as if she weighed nothing, then carefully helped Ayanna up behind her. "Hold tight to sister," he instructed. "She keep you safe on horse. You keep her safe in heart." As they prepared to leave, Clementine took one final look at the cabin that had been her world. The morning sun painted its weathered walls gold, and for a moment she could almost see her grandmother standing in the doorway, nodding with approval at the choice her granddaughter had made. The war party moved out silently, following deer trails that wound through dense forest and across hidden streams. The warriors had positioned themselves protectively around the two girls, with scouts ranging ahead and behind to watch for pursuit. Every few minutes, Chief Running Bear would ride close enough to check on them, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. But it was Ayanna who proved to be Clementine's anchor during those first terrifying hours. Despite her injured leg, she remained steady behind Clementine, offering quiet words of encouragement whenever the younger girl seemed overwhelmed. She pointed out landmarks: an eagle's nest high in an ancient pine, a waterfall that sang through the rocks, a meadow where wild horses often grazed. "My people," Ayanna said softly, using the English words carefully, "travel these paths many seasons. Safe paths, protected paths." The deeper they rode into the wilderness, the more Clementine understood that she was entering a world that existed parallel to everything she had known. This was an empty frontier land, as the settlers believed. It was home to people who knew every stream, every game trail, every place where medicinal herbs grew. As the sun reached its peak, they crested a ridge that took Clementine's breath away. Spread below them was a valley she had never imagined existed, a hidden paradise where a clear river meandered through grasslands dotted with teepees. Smoke rose peacefully from cooking fires, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks. Children played near the water's edge, while women worked on elaborate beadwork, and men tended to horses that moved like poetry across the landscape. "Home," Ayanna whispered, and Clementine could hear the joy and relief in her voice. But as they began their descent into the valley, Clementine noticed that people were stopping their activities to stare. Word of their approach had clearly preceded them, and curiosity about the white child was evident on every face they passed. Some expressions showed welcoming interest, while others displayed obvious concern or suspicion. A few elder women spoke rapidly among themselves, gesturing toward Clementine with what looked like serious debate. Chief Running Bear rode ahead to speak with a group of tribal leaders who had gathered near the largest teepee. Their conversation was brief but intense, with several pointed glances in Clementine's direction. She couldn't understand their words, but she could read the tension in their body language. Finally, the chief returned and helped both girls down from their horse. The entire tribe had gathered in a large circle around them, creating an arena of curious and expectant faces. "My people must hear the story," Running Bear explained to Clementine. "Must understand why White Child wears sacred medallion. Must decide if village accepts new daughter." Clementine's heart hammered as she realized that her fate, and perhaps Ayanna's as well, hung in the balance of this moment. The circle of faces seemed to stretch endlessly around Clementine as Chief Running Bear began speaking to his people. His voice carried the weight of ceremony as he recounted the events of the past day, how his daughter had been lost, how a small white child had risked her own safety to save a stranger, and how that act of pure kindness had bridged two worlds that had known only conflict. Ayanna stepped forward despite her injured leg, her young voice clear and strong as she added her own testimony. She spoke with passion about Clementine's courage at the river, about the gentle care she had received through the night, and about finding friendship where she had expected fear. An elderly woman near the front of the circle, her hair silver with age and her face marked by the wisdom of many seasons, raised her hand to speak. Her words were measured and thoughtful, and Clementine could sense that this woman held significant influence among people. The debate that followed was respectful but thorough. Some voices expressed concern about bringing a white child into their community during such dangerous times. Others spoke of ancient traditions about hospitality and the sacred duty to protect those who showed kindness to their own. But it was a small voice that ultimately swayed the decision. A boy no older than 6 pushed through the crowd and walked directly to Clementine. He looked up at her with bright, curious eyes and said something in his native tongue that made the entire circle fall silent. Chief Running Bear translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, "She has the same sad eyes as me. When my mother went to the spirits. Sad children should not be alone." The elderly woman stepped forward and studied Clementine for a long moment. Then she reached out and gently touched the sacred medallion resting against the child's chest. When she spoke again, her tone had changed completely. Warm, accepting, final. Chief Running Bear smiled as he translated her words. Grandmother Singing Bird says, "The spirit sent you to save Ayanna because they knew we needed to save you, too." She says, "A child brave enough to save a stranger is a child worthy of our protection." The circle erupted in voices of agreement and welcome. Women came forward with gifts of clothing and food, while children gathered around with shy but friendly curiosity. Men nodded their respect for the young girl who had shown such courage. As the sun began to set over the hidden valley, Clementine found herself sitting by a warm fire, Ayanna beside her, surrounded by the sounds of a family larger than she had ever imagined possible. The sacred medallion caught the firelight, and she understood now that it represented more than honor. It was a promise of belonging. The lonely cabin by the river felt like a memory from another lifetime. Here in this place where two worlds had learned to meet in friendship, both girls had found something more precious than safety. They had found home, and as the stars appeared overhead, Clementine whispered a prayer of gratitude to her grandmother's spirit, knowing that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest act of kindness.